but it looks like we are recording. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in with me today. Another installment. Folks, I have a very special guest for you today. His name is Dyer. Some really, really fascinating content he's come up with over the years. He's been doing this for a really long time. Very interesting, just certainly wildly different from my own point of view. But I am taking it as a personal challenge. I think it's important that as researchers and also as producers of content that we look at all different worldviews and just broaden the mind, expand the consciousness. So Jay, thank you so much for being here with me today. Could you please give my audience, I'm sure some of them know who you are. You've been around for so long and you work with so many different people, but I'm sure a lot of people are not familiar with your body of work. So could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jay Dyer. I do jaysanalysis.com, and I have a growing YouTube channel which houses most of my videos. I think I have about 700 or 800 articles I've written over the last several years. That eventually became a book called Esoteric Hollywood, which has done pretty well. It's been out for about a year, and then that led to a TV show called Hollywood Decoded with Gaia. The full first season of that is out now, so that's available at Amazon Prime and Gaia and different streaming sites. And that's kind of based on the idea of just deconstructing movies in terms of their symbolism, the philosophy behind movies. And then I'm now co-host of Worski Live, which is a fairly popular YouTube channel with Andy Worski, kind of a Joe Rogan, Howard Stern style interview show where we cut a lot of jokes, but we also talk about real topics in philosophy and issues and conspiracies and interview some pretty neat people. And then I was just in a Oliver Stone, Sean Stone production about Hollywood. So it's a mini documentary called Hollywood DC, which aired on RT, but that's at my YouTube channel as well. And so that's what I do is I kind of tie in politics, geopolitics, conspiracy, philosophy, history, religion, comparative religion, theology, and a lot of movie analysis. So I look at pop culture, I look at film symbolism and what they're trying to tell us, both in a veiled way and in a very in-your-face way through movies. I also do a lot of comedy and satire and skit type stuff too.
Oh, it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. I listened to bits and pieces of the Worski Live show. And
oh, yeah.
You guys, it's just the banter and the profanity. I love it. I appreciate such a thing, especially when we can, you guys have found a way to integrate some really, offensive stuff, but tied it in with, where we're discussing content that is, just things that are so important and lend themselves so well to the progression of humanity. I don't mean that in a liberal sense, like progressives. I just mean the betterment of humanity and sort of getting to the bottom of things. So you guys have found a really interesting balance between offensive comedy and like the truth of the matter. So certainly really appreciate that. So upon, preparation for this interview, I did a lot of like cramming of everything well, not everything, because your body of work is just massive, but something that stuck out to me the most, now this is kind of digging into your biography a little bit, but I heard you mention that you're from California, you grew up in California?
Yeah, San Diego.
Okay, great. So I think you mentioned something about attending an elementary school that was like a new age, sort of experimental, just this really, that really struck a chord with me, because I wonder, how that played into your, later needing to seek and wanting to ask questions. What was that like? And what do you mean when you say new age, experimental, just child education? That's if it was different from anything else, different from what we, public school, certainly.
Sure. Well, California is, I think you could very easily establish a military industrial complex state. The whole state is essentially suffused with the presence of military bases, Silicon Valley, deep state type operations pretty much everywhere. I don't think that my entrance into that school was necessarily some conspiracy. It wasn't like I was being put through some mind control program or anything like that. It was just a thing where they took gifted kids and put them in a different type of more experimental forms of education than what the other public schools were doing. So experimental in the sense that it was, it wasn't all bad. There were some positive aspects to it. Like we would really just kind of sit around and read books and do art and things like that instead of, because I actually went to a performing arts elementary, but so we would do that instead of the more typical rote forms of memorization and reading, writing, and arithmetic in the traditional sense. So, we still did that, but it was sort of just a more advanced experimentational form of that. And there was a lot of cultural studies, so it was very multicultural. And of course, that's kind of how California is at root anyway. But when I say New Age, this is an actual movement that was funded by a lot of very powerful people for a specific purpose. So the Rockefeller family, a lot of other wealthy interests, particularly through entities like the Esalen Institute. There's tons of think tanks that have backed this. And a lot of it had to do with Stanford research and Tavistock Institute studies on how to alter culture on a mass scale. So one of the things that they wanted to do was give everyone a new way to view the world and man himself. And it was not for benevolent reasons. So I'm not saying that everybody who looks into or gets into the New Age is inherently bad or anything like that. There's a lot of sincere people looking at different ideas. But one of the things I try to stress is that a lot of the ideas that we have are ideas that were given to us, and even sometimes we don't realize it. So when I looked into that experimental elementary school, I later found out that it was UN connected and that it was a kind of test bed. So I think what that was a way to recruit people who were future leaders, basically. Right. And then to kind of instill in them and bring them up into the mindset of globalism. But if you're familiar with my work, you know that I critique globalism pretty severely, because I see that as kind of the root of the conspiracy. The whole idea here is that we can wipe everyone out and destroy everybody's uniqueness through globalism. So it's really the heart of the conspiracy, and that's why I would be opposed to it.
Wow, fascinating, really fascinating. And I know you say that you don't think that there was any conspiracy involved with you attending that school, and I certainly wouldn't, because I guess we would be implicating your parents and what kind of, agenda they had.
My dad was enlisted in the military, so that's like anybody. That's what you do when you don't have a college degree. You can enlist. So he wasn't like a admiral, so he was a very low level guy. It wasn't something where no, it's just that I had high IQ, so they put me in California. You do all those tests and stuff, and if you qualify for certain levels, they'll put you into different schooling, because the education is completely statist. It's totally controlled by the state. So, it is conspiratorial, but I'm just saying that it wasn't me as someone special. It was, a lot of kids that were stuck in there too.
You wouldn't say you're special? You don't think you're special, Jay?
No, I just mean that I wasn't part of a secret government mind control project. Okay. That's all I'm saying.
All right. No, I hear what you're saying.
I'm more like special ed, you know what I mean?
Right. Sure. But okay. So, and I'm certainly not trying to convince you that you were, somehow involved in some kind of, grouping of brilliant children and groomed and whatnot. However, wouldn't you say that, MK Ultra has been employed now, it's evolved so much over the years, so much so to the point where I think that everybody on some level has been subjected to, mind control, whether it be MK Ultra or some other kind of mind control. So it doesn't seem far-fetched to me, especially also, government and military associations, doesn't matter high level or low level. It's simply easier access. So, and certainly you have carved out a very special place for yourself in the community, and to be able to share knowledge and awaken people and help people out in that way. So, from my perspective, from where I'm standing, there may have been something there. I don't know. They sifted you, through the sifting process. They might have been like, oh, this guy's special. So, just from where I'm standing, it is interesting to me. I notice these things.
Well, special in the sense of there are gifted programs in most states. So, right. I mean, special in that sense, I guess. Yeah. But, you know, there were quite a few other kids involved in it as well. And it only ran, I was only there until about sixth or seventh grade. So it wasn't like, you know, I was in some underground base where, you know, they were like hooking me up to machines.
You
And
might not remember even if you were. And I'm not suggesting,
yeah.
I'm just entertaining the possibility that there is technology that we don't understand. We don't know the mechanics of it to where they could create such, you know.
So maybe I'm like an AI thing. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Like
Certainly not.
if I cut my arm open, it's going to be
Right.
wires.
Let's just rip your mask off and you're just all cyborg underneath. Wouldn't that be pretty? Okay. So something else we may do a little bit of jumping around here. But your breakdown of the Kubrick film Eyes Wide Shut was just so mind-blowing to me. And it at this point in the game, it's expected. But you made this point of how at the time when it was released, I believe it was 1999. I mean, I was just a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was 10 years old in 1999. You know, we were only later and only in recent years, in retrospect, were we able to see the significance of some of the symbology in this film and really what it meant. And, right. You know, a lot of my followers, I shouldn't say followers, I should say subscribers, because nobody follows me. I'm very boring and uninteresting and lame. But a lot of people have stuck with me because of the interest that I've taken in the exposure of the elite pedophile networks. And if I understand correctly, you made note of some very blatant references to elite pedophilia made in that film. And now it's very clear, if anybody's paying attention, that a lot of these, you know, sort of the techniques that they employ to gain access to children, and, you know, all the various organizations that sort of stand watch and utilize these portals as means to get children into that system, into these trafficking rings. Do you think that it was a kind of sort of not a precursor, but a way to implement that thought, implement that idea into the collective conscious, to kind of prepare us or ready us for the exposure of the elite pedophile rings? I mean, why do they release this stuff? Why do they let us know in film and music what's going on? Why tell us if it doesn't serve them in some way? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that, you know, different directors and producers and people at times have different motives. So I can't ascribe everything to one person or to Kubrick's motives, but I would say that there's quite consciously throughout his films a consistent narrative of showing that the elite do engage in pedophilia. So if we think back to, let's see, it's not in 2001 that I can think of, but if we look at Clockwork Orange, Alex is molested by his government CPS worker type guy. So it's right there as a prominent example in one of his most well-known films. It's present in Barry Lyndon, which is another one of his epic sort of dramas that's fairly well known, but certainly not as popular as, you know, 2001 or something like that. He did Lolita, which the whole premise of Lolita is that, you know, the underage girl and the older guy. He did Eyes Wide Shut, obviously. The Shining. The Shining has, you know, he's the child is molested by the Jack Nicholson character. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty subtle in the film, but if you watch it a couple times, you pick it up. So the point is just that this is a theme that's run throughout Kubrick films, and I think, yeah, he's consciously saying this is what goes on, and that was kind of the point of Eyes Wide Shut, is to sort of tie that theme all together and say that the billionaire trillionaire class, they, you know, this is nothing to what they do. I mean, in other words, they're sort of, when you've engaged in all the pleasures that you can, you kind of get to this certain point where the only thing that you find entertaining or pleasurable is more and more degrading stuff. Mm-hmm. So that was part of the point of that film, I think, was that the Tom Cruise character, Bill Harford, he thinks initially that he's at the top of the totem pole because he's a successful doctor in New York, and his wife is a successful art teacher or whatever she does. But then he realizes that there's a whole class of powerful people above him, and that they can actually function like an intelligence agency. and not just an intelligence agency, but they're a cult. And it's a lot of really wealthy, powerful people. And, you know, what we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years of research and even mainstream media, if you follow this stuff, is that that's very real. We're seeing these patterns of things come out, you know, with the Franklin cover-up, with Savile in the UK, the pedophile MPs in the UK, with all of these recent cases, Penn State with Sandusky. This is a very real thing. So, yeah, I think Kubrick is consciously telling us this through film. But I would say, just to be a little more precise, I don't know. I don't know for sure what Kubrick's motives were, if he was at times sincerely trying to warn people or expose this. Or maybe, at least I know in other cases, people are in the media intentionally trying to soften people up to the idea of that, because it's all part of the larger agenda of social engineering. So that goes back to what you were talking about earlier, is that, you know, if you look at a white paper like Changing Images of Man from Stanford Research in the 70s, this shows that the establishment, the deep state, has been interested in socially engineering man on all levels across society. And one of those in that research deals with sexuality. So to alter and completely change human sexuality is a big part of the global plan. And that's really the essence of Eyes Wide Shut, is that there's human trafficking going on. That's the Lily Sobieski character in the Milich, who owns the costume shop. His daughter, right? He's pimping her out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we know that she's present at the ritual because she whispers something in Bill's ear, which gives the indication that she's been to the ritual, because she tells him what to wear to get in. Yeah. So yeah, there you go. That's all there in 1999. And of course, you know, nobody knew about elite pedophilia in 1999. This was unheard of. Now, however, with all of these cases, with, you know, Epstein's Lolita Express and all this stuff that's been exposed, I mean, it's pretty blatant.
So would you say that the exposure is genuine? You don't think that this is some kind of a very specialized, well thought out strategy to, you know, further trap us in some way, or some
well, no. What I said was that sometimes it's a case of normalization, where they're intentionally putting these stories. There's a movie that just came out that was controversial about underage, you know, NAMBLA type older guy, young boy, gay story that was so controversial, and that kind of stuff is intended to soften people up. What I'm saying is that in the case of Kubrick specifically, I don't know his heart or his motives, so I don't know exactly what he was after, if he was intentionally trying to expose it, or if he was intentionally wanting to soften people up to the idea. I tend to think he probably was pretty anti-establishment.
Sure. He's
at least from his perspective.
Right. Okay. Understood. So, you know, you talk about this sort of normalization. We see this happening all over the place. I mean,
right.
You know, it's just nasty. You can't even turn on primetime television without the, you know, the token sort of, you know, the SJW and the, you know, between the gender issues and the race issues, there's just all across the board, all of these means of division. And in your perspective, to what end does this take us? If there is no resistance, or, you know, if there is no pushback, or sort of a, you know, a kind of stasis where we can find ourselves some balance and see through this agenda, you know, to what end do you think that they're going to try to push it? What do you think they see for humanity?
Well, I mean, they're pretty open and pretty clear about what their goal is and what the end is. One of the things that I do is I do a lecture series called the Globalist Book Series, and I basically cover just the writings of top globalist thinkers from their perspective. So it's not conspiratorial, because I'm just reading their works and telling you what they're talking about. Everybody can go buy these books and see for themselves. And so they're pretty open about what they write about. I mean, I have one of the books that I covered that's pretty telling is H.G. Wells's book, The Open Conspiracy. And in The Open Conspiracy, you know, this is the guy who wrote Island of Dr. Moreau, Time Machine, you know, the father of science fiction. Is essentially, most Hollywood science fiction has some, you know, homage to H.G. Wells, right? War of the Worlds. And he was quite consciously a conspirator in this global plan. He writes about it, again, openly. He's got other books called The New World Order. Like
Right.
how much more clear could it be?
Right.
But what he and others say is that the idea is basically to break down all existing firewalls, family, nation, culture, tradition, heritage, all that goes away. And then we create one giant global monoculture. And then that goes underneath the global government. And the global government will be basically a Fabian socialist model on one level. And then you kind of have the moneyed technocratic oligarchy at the top. So there's like two layers to this. And the Fabian socialist managerial strata, that they'll be the bureaucrats that run everybody's lives. A lot of things will be run by AI, smart cities, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all outlined again in all their books. I did a whole series on one of the top. He's the Kissinger of France. His name is Jacques Attali. And he explains this in detail. So what you see is that all the way back in the teens and 20s, from H.G. Wells, the 30s, all the way up to 2006, when this book was written, the plan is unified. It's the exact same plan. There's no changes. It just goes through phases to get to that end goal. So the end goal is transhumanism, is mass depopulation, total technocratic control grid, and everybody being essentially put into a Brave New World scenario. If you've read Brave New World, which everybody should read that, because that's the essence of the whole plan in fiction, and that was written in 1932.
Wow, amazing how they just it's all there for us.
Mm-hmm.
So based on what is happening right now on the political spectrum, and just everywhere we look, would you say that they are successfully carrying out their plan, or do you feel, most specifically, what I'd like to bring to your attention was the kind of switch, if a switch even took place, or this kind of rift in their plan where Trump was elected and not Hillary. Do you feel that that was planned nonetheless?
I've gone back and forth on that, just because a lot of what actions Trump has taken seem to be pretty contrary to the plan of globalism. And then what you kind of come to figure out is that there's basically two schools amongst globalists. There's the neoconservatives, who are the older American imperial type view, the Bush, Cheney, neocon view, who thinks that America should extend Americanism to the globe. And then there's another faction that believes in the idea of just the United Nations and straight up globalism. Now, these aren't really in opposition. I mean, they will basically argue different game plans and strategies, but they both basically have the same end goal, which is global government. And that global government will basically be continental unions. And then within the continental unions, you'll have these federations all linked into one giant global government. And then it will be run essentially by AI. All of the giant mega cities, so they're going to have megalopolises, giant smart grid type areas. They'll try to push everybody out of the rural areas into Judge Dredd type scenarios, big computer cities. And again, this is all laid out in a pretty dystopian fashion. But when it comes to Trump, I mean, he did take a lot of actions that seem to be contrary to the more UN style globalists. But he's pretty busy putting in a lot of these neoconservative globalists. So just two flavors of the same. It's Baskin Robbins with two flavors. You're still going to get Baskin Robbins at the end of the day. You're not going to get a different brand of GMO corn syrup.
And the people say, "Hey, well, we love ice cream, so ice cream is ice cream, right? Let's just take it."
Right, and that's just because from their perspective, it doesn't really matter. I mean, Brzezinski writes about this in some of his articles, is that from his perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it's Americanism that extends to the globe and becomes the global government, or whether it's the United Nations version of globalism that becomes the global government, because the end goal is the same. It's just, and they're pragmatic. They're not committed to specific ideologies. They're committed to whatever works. So I don't think from their perspective they really care which system it is, because systems are interchangeable and just useful as tools to achieve pragmatic ends. But yeah, so I'm kind of black-pilled on politics. I mean, I think that we can be discussing and engaged to some degree, but I don't put a whole lot of hope in political change, because I think we have to change ourselves first before we can expect a lot of external things to be changed to save us or fix us. It's not going to happen.
I can agree with you wholeheartedly there. That an external transformation begins with an internal one. I personally believe in the as above, so below idea. The micro and the macro, the reflection and whatnot. But just before we move on, I wanted to ask you if you felt that the exposure of the elite pedophile rings that couldn't be beneficial to anybody's plan, neoconservatives or the UN guys. It just seems detrimental.
Well, in ways it could, because it's not going to be beneficial to the people that are busted. But if you've paid attention, as you get older, I'm not saying I'm like old, but if you watch mainstream media and the way media works over time, then you begin to notice things like how even scandals can change people's perspectives on things. So, for example, Heidi Fleiss back in the 90s, she was a famous madam and she was busted. And I did an analysis of Q and all that stuff, and Heidi Fleiss played into that because of prostitution and sex rings and stuff. But what I found relevant about one of her interviews was that she says that before I came along, the idea of cheating was still viewed as something that's not morally good and taboo. And she said, what I realized was that my scandal normalized cheating for a lot of people. So that is a scandal that was used. And then it became, she also says that I kind of paved the way for reality TV. So, you can debate that to whatever degree you want, but she was at least cognizant of the fact that the way marketing and PR and social engineering and psychological warfare all work together is that even a scandal can prepare people for accepting things in the future that they normally wouldn't have. So, for example, when Bill Clinton is, I did not sleep with that woman. He didn't have sex, right? But so what happens in the scandal breaks, you've got like 6th graders, 5th graders, 4th graders seeing all over the news, basically fellatio discussion.
That was me. I was so I couldn't believe it. I think, my gosh, what was that, 95?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thereabouts. I was just a baby, and that everywhere it became,
Yeah,
it opened up that conversation, and I can certainly see how that
right. So now, and I'm not saying that the busts of people involved in the pedo stuff is bad in itself. No, there should be busts. It should be illegal, absolutely. But what I'm saying is that even at times scandals can be for the purpose of softening people up. And in fact, that's what we're seeing now, is that a lot of these really extreme publications like Salon are putting out articles like, oh, now it's time to have the discussion of whether or not, we can have child adult sex legalized. Now it's time to have the discussion. But it wasn't a discussion. The only reason it's time to have a discussion is because they're saying it is. And that's all part of that process of moving the Overton window, basically, to make it simple.
I completely understand that. Very recently, I watched a press conference or some kind of an address by George Soros, to where he certainly critiqued Donald Trump's, his shakeup of the way that things have been or the way that things were. But he actually commended him on his ability to get people thinking. He said, for every supporter that he has inspired, he has motivated 2 or more in as contentious, self-motivated people. So he gave Donald Trump this credit for being able to divide people, basically, and that certainly plays into the likes of George Soros and what they would like to see for humanity. So
but that's very hypocritical on his part, because he funds all these movements globally, these NGOs and these radical groups, for the purpose of division.
Oh, he's a hypocrite? I had no idea. George Soros? No way. Get out. You're lying. So, wow. Okay. It's just the whole, I wanted to ask you, and I was kind of worried to go here because I'm like, oh God, he's gonna, how could you believe such a thing? Or, because you have to understand, watching you interact with a lot of your peers and people that you have on your show and whose shows you go on, you can be you can be really brash, like like I'm certainly not prepared to debate you on any one thing today, but I did want to ask, please be gentle with me because it's a very emotional thing. But
Well, that's what men do. Men engage in logic and debates. So that's a traditionally
and women
masculine.
don't, right?
Well, women argue. I don't know if they debate.
Right.
Ooh, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
No, it's quite all right. It's fine. It is interesting though. We will approach a situation with a lot more emotion and a lot
Sure.
less logic. Logic tends to go out the window when a subject is very emotionally charged. So I will give you that. We are different. I certainly am no fan of feminism. I consider myself an anti-feminist, actually. But whatever. Who cares for labels, really? But I'm certain of the Pizzagate/Pedogate scandal. And I wanted to know if you felt that was, now I believe the term used is called a red herring, which is sort of one of those things that is just dropped like a bomb into the collective consciousness and used for purposes of, whether it be a distraction or, something that was strategically timed to be introduced into the populace to get people thinking a certain thing or to have people, engage in a certain conversation. What do you think about that particular scandal, Pizzagate, as resulted by the WikiLeaks and the Podesta emails and all that stuff? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can only go with what I can prove. So I didn't say there was no pedogate. I mean, I made a video and I talked about Epstein's Lolita Express, and that is confirmed because there was, prosecution, court conviction, and so forth. But what I said was that there hasn't been any of that in the case of pedogate. That doesn't mean that I think John Podesta is a good guy. It doesn't mean I don't think he's creepy and weird and the Podesta's art. I know all that stuff, but I mean, I'm only going to go with how far I can prove something because I'm also cognizant of the fact that PR companies can be hired to create red herrings and fake stories to destroy or distract from another kind of real scandal. This happens quite frequently. There's, in fact, a movie that illustrates this very well because I deal a lot with movies. And it was the one with Jessica Chastain called Mrs. Sloan. So people that aren't familiar with how PR fits into this whole giant globalist matrix should watch that movie because although it's goofy and Hollywoodized, I don't agree with everything about it. It is insightful in that it shows how she, working in these DC PR firms, can create and craft stories in the news, not just to change opinion, but also to distract and get people away from something that's a real scandal. So, a sex scandal, for example, I'm not saying that Pedogate or Pizzagate is completely fake, but I'm just saying a sex scandal is a great way to divert everybody's attention from something that might be a real scandal. And that doesn't mean that the sex scandal is false. It just means that sometimes things serve different functions. So there's cases where, people in the Pizzagate situation claim to have verified that there were these back doors at Comet Pizza or whatever, but I don't know. I can't personally verify all that because first of all, I don't have the time to do that, and I'm not going to travel to DC and try to track down the cops that people talk to, and that's just not feasible for me to do. So I can only go with what I can prove, and what it looks like to me was that at least the code words, yes, which could have been standing for something like child porn or whatever. They could also have stood for drugs, ordering drugs. That's commonly done as well in the DC area, is to have code words for drugs and so forth. But you have to be careful about what you say publicly, that if you can't prove something, because you can be liable for lawsuits. So that's why I consistently said the exact same thing the entire time of Pizzagate, was that, there's some weird stuff here, but I can't objectively prove it either way. So, this can only, for me, remain in the realm of speculation. But in all of these other cases, like Savile, Sandusky, Pedogate with Lolita Express and Jeffrey Epstein, countless cases of people being convicted for child trafficking, this kind of stuff, that's all provable and real. But it's just unrealistic and kind of absurd to expect that I can sift through 4chan and figure out, who's guilty of what. That's not how the legal system works. It's not, I mean, unfortunately, the conspiracy version of things can oftentimes turn into like a mob rule scenario, and then all the system has to do is set up some guy who supposedly comes and shoots up Comet Ping Pong with a gun or something, and it just destroys the whole thing. So it's very easy. The system knows how to play people very, very easily, and you have to be smarter than just being duped into something like that. So I didn't say it was fake. I didn't say it was real. I just said that it's not something that I can definitively prove. And yes, I read all of the emails that were relevant to that situation, but those emails, I mean, I don't know what it means that there's going to be a child in a bathtub or whatever. Like, does that mean that he's picking up somebody else's kids or he's ordering? So in other words, that would have to be proven in a court, right? And you can't just accuse people of things just based on the basis of that kind of a thing. It has to be demonstrated with proof and evidence. I mean, that's part of our legal system, at least in theory. I know that a lot of times it doesn't work that way.
Proof and evidence, proof and evidence.
And I'm not covering up for wicked people. I just sat here and said that there's like 6 other cases that are confirmed convictions where people were guilty of this. But it stands to reason that somebody should be coming forward, and there should be some kind of prosecution of this situation if that's what was going on. And yes, I'm familiar with Laura Silsby and the case of her conviction in terms of Haiti and the Clinton Foundation. Yeah, I'm familiar with all that, but I'm just saying you have to be careful about what kind of accusations you make, because these are people who will take you to court if you misstate things.
Sure, certainly. And thank you for reminding us of that. Certainly I need reminding of such a thing. I tend to let my mouth just go without having anything other than circumstantial evidence and a very, very strong intuitive feeling. That leads me to my next question is, how do you feel about intuition? And I know that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but your point of reference I've heard you make repeatedly is the First Testament, correct? I feel like I've heard you refer to scripture as being, sort of the end all be all, or scripture tells us this, or Genesis tells us this, that sort of thing. I've heard you say that. I don't know if what you're suggesting is that is the authoritative, the source of information from which all things, sprout. But please correct me. Let me know what.
Well, I mean, I do believe that the Bible is revelation, and it does reveal to us truths about God, and that it is accurate. But the term Old Testament and New Testament, that just refers to the basically the compiling of the books from the period of Abraham, Genesis, Abraham, up to Moses and King David. That's the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible for simplicity's sake. Wow. And then the New Testament is the period of writings after the time of Christ. So that's what makes up the Christian Bible, the Old and the New Testament writings.
Okay.
But so, yes, I think that they are authoritative and useful in revealing theological truths. But I certainly don't think that all truths are only in the Bible. I mean, the Bible itself does not claim to have all truths in it. The Bible itself says there's true philosophy. It says that there's true truths about science. There's truths about human nature. There's all kinds of truths that are not simply encoded in one single book. That would be absurd.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. And I certainly, the Bible, biblical texts are so far out of my wheelhouse. It's not even funny. But, moving into this, I would very much like to learn. I'm certainly open to all of it. And I can really appreciate your perspective on things. So I believe that I've heard you refer to Christian orthodoxy. Orthodoxy that's your POV. And I really have to agree with you when you say that, we will enact no external changes, no societal changes or the betterment of anything until we sort of go through those processes internally. And I happen to agree with that. So in your perspective, what do you think that the human being has to do in order to get there? I mean, I know that's just such a huge question. It's so expansive, but is it as simple as obey the 10 commandments? Or, I'm surely that's not that simple, because as human nature, we are kind of striving against ourselves. Society programs us to want this, and that. We have, needs and desires and all of these influences that tear us away from that. But in your understanding of it, what really can we do, and can we expect to get there?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of my videos, I do promote Orthodox Christianity, which I think is the best and most authentic and historic form of Christianity. So, for me, that is where one finds the healing of the soul and body. So, for us, Orthodoxy is kind of like the true religious psychotherapy. It's not merely psychotherapy, but what a lot of people seek in psychology, we think is solved through Orthodox, what we might call logotherapy, or the idea of the logos and submitting to Christ as the logos, and therefore transforming and changing us through that process. So really, this just involves learning the religion, believing, and in our view, you have to join the Orthodox Church. We believe that is the God's kingdom on earth. So the Orthodox Church is distinct from Roman Catholicism. Certainly, the East and the West, for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, share roughly the same unified structure and heritage. But around 1054, the East and the West split into two different churches. So you have Roman Catholicism in the West, and then you have Orthodox Christianity in the East. So, yeah, I mean, there's some 200-300 million Orthodox Christians in the world today. And I think there's like 700-800 million Roman Catholics in the world. And then I don't know how many Protestants there are, but yeah, so it's very distinct from both of those flavors of Christianity, or Christianity so-called. But the distinctive doctrine that we tend to talk about is the idea that Christ came to make us immortal. Christ came to deify us. So this is not the idea of apotheosis, or being made into a god in the sense of like Crowley, or what a lot of New Age or Hindu teaching proposes. It's rather that God, that we share in the life of God himself. God's own life is given to us because after the fall, we were made mortal and corruptible, and our lives are out of whack. So we're not inherently evil, but like you said, we do kind of strive against, there's a conflict in all of us. So while the Ten Commandments is really just a summation of what we call the basic moral law, which is natural, it's universal. Everybody has a basic sense on their heart from birth, from conception, of what is right and wrong. This can be muddled, and we can be confused, and we all sin, and we all do things wrong. So we need more than just an idea of a law code. We actually need the power to be made more immortal and to overcome death, because we're all subject to death. And we believe that the purpose of Christ's coming was the resurrection, and to raise us to the possibility of participating in eternal life in the bodily resurrection. So this is very distinct from a lot of Gnostic and New Age ideas, where we're going to shed the body and go into some astral realm. Now, we actually think the creation and the human body was a good thing. That's why we believe Jesus became incarnate. He became and took on human nature, because it's good. And he did that to defeat the power of death. So that's the whole purpose of the gospel. That's the whole message. That's the message of the gospel, is the resurrection. That's how we overcome death and participate in immortality and eternal life. And without that, we view people as essentially subject to bondage, corruption, decay, death, misery. And so, in a sense, hell begins in this life, as does heaven.
Wow. That's I've never heard it explained quite like that. And it is, it's different from my understanding of it, in that, the body is, we understand it as, we experience it as being so limiting, and we age and we get sick and we eventually die and that sort of thing. And, we tend to fantasize or dream about this time when we can be made immortal in limitless form, and we can fly around and have just all of this, superpowers, and these various ideas that we adopt over the years. But I have never heard it explained in a way where we stay in our bodies, we stay here on planet Earth, and we just sort of live forever. So that is interesting to me.
Well, if you read basically the best way to summarize this is if you read Genesis in the beginning, God creates man and puts him in Eden. And so Eden was a higher spiritual state before the fall. It wasn't immaterial, it was material. And then when man fell, the universe was altered as a result of the fall. Everything became subject to death, decay, entropy, etc. And then when we read the Gospels, if you read, for example, the Gospel of John, by the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus is walking around after the resurrection in a risen physical body, but it's the same body that he has because Thomas puts his fingers in his side and says, Lord, now I believe, right? So it's not immaterial. It's not a phantasm or a ghost. It's the same body, but it's no longer subject to death, decay, and corruption because he overcame death, decay, and corruption in the resurrection because he's God. So God destroyed death, which was our enemy, so that we could participate in that life and go back to an Eden type state. So the idea for the future and for eternity is just simply what God intended from the beginning, which is Eden.
I'll tell you, I mean, it sounds nice to me. It sounds good to me. I'm certainly not, so set in any one school of thought that I can't, see things differently. But I wanted to ask you then if what's necessary, if what you feel is, the answer, basically, what happens to the billions of people that just don't ever get there, or don't ever accept that, don't ever look at that? Do they just, go about their soul's evolution and just repeat the cycle over and over again until one day they find, the Christian church? How would you characterize that? And also, after you explain that, could you please define your definition of the fall? I know you've made reference to that. And I understand the fall in other terms, but I really want to get your, how you see that.
Right. Well, so for us, the afterlife is a situation where everybody eventually will be resurrected. So even non-Christians are going to be resurrected, and that's because when Jesus took on human nature is universal. So all men are going to participate in the resurrection. But the way that we experience the next life will be determined on how we live in this life and what we choose. So if we love Christ, if we love God, if we love virtue, if we love truth, then we're moving towards God, and the presence of God is not something that we flee from anymore. If we don't, if we prefer wickedness and egoism and ourselves and the worship of ourselves over truth and the things that I listed, then what happens is we conform ourselves to a different kind of experience in the afterlife. So what happens is that we it's not that you go away from God, because God is everywhere. You can't get away from God. It's rather that your experience of God becomes something that torments you because you hate God. So for us, for the righteous, for those in the church that experience the afterlife in the truest sense, it's the same presence of God that the wicked have. It's not different places or locales. It's the same presence of God. It's just experienced differently on the basis of what we choose in this life. So that's why I was saying that heaven, in our view, begins in this life just as much as hell can begin in this life. So, I mean, I can remember back to, when I didn't have any kind of belief or worldview. It was just kind of wandering around, listless. I was very unhappy. I was very miserable. And for me, that was an objective state of decay, loneliness, misery, and so forth. And so there was a pretty evident change in my life, when I came to believe these things. So for us, it's a very real thing. It's not something that is like just pushed off into the afterlife. It all begins in the here and now. So for us, the church itself, again, is the kingdom of God here on earth. And it's really the church looks ahead to what the eternal state's going to be. So if we were to take a bunch of, wicked people and bring them into church, they're not going to have a good time. They're going to hate it. They're going to, and I'm speaking specifically of the Orthodox Church, which is very distinct. You can look up online the Orthodox liturgy and see how it goes. And I mean, it's very beautiful. It's very aesthetically appealing. And that's because it's modeled after what we see in the Apocalypse. going on in heaven. So that's what we think is the reality. So it's not so much that there's a like some place where there's a volcano and lava, and God just like consistently dips you in and out of the lava to, please himself. It's rather that your experience is your choices are going to determine how you experience God in the afterlife, and you're never going to get away from God. And that's the thing that most torments the wicked.
Certainly, the idea of separation, that you can somehow outrun it. I feel like we see that a lot with these black magicians, and trying to outsmart nature and find loopholes and somehow override natural order of things. And certainly we see how things play out for them in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I did want to ask you also if you could characterize for us your definition of the fall, because I know that particular epic is recorded, has been interpreted in many different ways by many different cultures, and all kinds of stories and characters arise from this, and it's all very interesting. It's a lot of fun. But I would like to get your very educated view on things.
So Adam and Eve represented our first forefathers in the Garden of Eden. They were the first humans created by God. And when they fell, what that means is that they chose to rebel. So they went along with Satan, who there was already an angelic fall prior to the fall of Adam and Eve. And God allowed the testing of Adam and Eve, and they decided to go into rebellion. So Adam and Eve linked their will to the serpent, to Satan. These are symbolic forms. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't real. It was real, but we don't know what the physical status of what it was like in Eden. It was different than it is after Adam and Eve fell. So what this did was it introduced death. So the serpent deceived man, and man rebelled, and that brought a state of death, decay, and destruction. So this is why the world, not just humans, but animals, everything experiences death, decay, entropy, corruption, because Adam and Eve stood as our representatives. They were the stewards of the human race. And so whatever they did, they brought that same principle into their lineage. So we all die because we are all subjects. We're all sons of Adam and Eve. And so Christ represents the new Adam. He comes to undo the mistakes and the fall that Adam introduced, and to reverse all that, and to restore things to what they were. So in this world, we live in a fallen world. That's what that means for us. That doesn't mean that the world is inherently bad. It's not a prison. It's not a trap for the soul. It's good, but it's a fallen good. It's a corrupted good. And eventually it will be restored and put into its proper natural state. But now for us, we do not believe, for example, that death is natural. We believe death is an unnatural thing. It's something that is preying, in a sense, on creation in a privational sense. And it puts us into an unnatural state of constantly fearing what's going to happen tomorrow, of basically wanting to preserve it puts us in a state of futility, because we're all still going to face death, but so many of our actions in life are motivated by the fear of death. And one of the things that's unique about Orthodox Christianity is that we believe death is itself transformed. Death is transformative and becomes now a good thing, because for us, death is the pathway into the kingdom of God in a real direct personal sense. So death for us death has lost its sting, Paul says in the New Testament.
Wow. About how old were you? Because you were just explaining that there was a point in your life when you hadn't come to this, this realization, and you hadn't found this information.
Well, I mean, I was raised Baptist, but I was kind of just nominally involved in that. So, throughout life, there's kind of phases, and it's more so a process. I mean, there can be kind of just very direct, miraculous, you might say, conversions where a person goes from being, extreme against theism or something like that into believing. That happens at times. But for me, it was, I was raised Baptist, but it wasn't very serious. And then, I don't know, around 18 or 19, I started reading the Bible consistently. And so it was just a long process of going through different schools of thought, different books, different writers, different churches, different groups, coming to finally believe in the coherence and truth of orthodoxy, which is a position I've had for, I guess, probably the last 8 or 9 years.
Okay. How old are you now? I'm so sorry if that's too personal of a question. Because you look like you might be like my age.
Well, how old is that?
29.
No, actually, I'm 38.
Oh, okay. So you're almost 10 years old. Well, you look great. You look super young. It might be that Orthodox lifestyle that you're living now.
Well, I mean, I'm, for a long time have been a big proponent of, GMO, not anti-GMO, organic food. I eat basically paleo. So yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So everybody, you hear that? You can look young and beautiful like Jay here if you just adopt the paleo and non-GMO diet. Don't take any pages out of my book because I eat carbs, I drink alcohol, I eat animal fat, all kinds of stuff.
Well, I eat a lot of meat, but I did have to eventually, like I stopped drinking about 8 or 9 years ago, not because of anything religious. Like we don't think that alcohol is inherently wrong, but I just found that the more I drank, the less I got done. So I decided that just for like practical business and health reasons, I would be way more productive not drinking. And I think it's borne out. I mean, if I'd have been drinking the last 8 years like I did in my 20s, I don't think I would have had, the book done, the TV show, like all this stuff done. It would have been like prolonged. So
I can seriously agree with you on that. I don't drink nearly as much as I used to in my early 20s. And I've really slowed down significantly now because my body just has a hard time metabolizing it.
Well, it's even more, yeah, your body rejects it even more in your 30s. So.
Oh, great. So, I mean, listen, it's one of those things where I could have 2 glasses of wine on a Friday night. I'm still feeling it, the next Wednesday. And
Yeah.
I look at myself and I see my skin's dry, my hair's dry. I'm like,
right.
This is really, really bad. There's got to be another way. But, it's kind of like, well, life is, we work so hard and we have our schedules and it's like, well, we need something. People search for something, some kind of an escape, whether it be weed or pills or alcohol and all of those things. So what does the Bible tell us about these various forms of escape, these chemicals and, these substances that sort of bring us to another place of awareness, whether it be positive, negative, anywhere in between?
Well, in our view, like I said a minute ago, nothing that exists is inherently bad, but the problem is in the misuse of things, right? So it's not inherently wrong to have medicine or have a beer or anything like that, but rather it's when these things become a controlling factor in our lives. And as fallen humans, we tend towards looking to those kinds of things to fulfill us and make us happy. And this in the Bible is what's called idolatry. So making idols is not just having a statue of a totem pole or something like that. It's rather, and that's part of it, but that's really just a manifestation of what's in the heart. So if I spend my whole life just trying to, for example, attain money, I'm captive to greed, and greed will control my life. I won't be free. I'll be a slave. I might think I'm free because I'm, getting all this money, but my whole life, my time, my thought, my energy becomes consumed by attaining fiat Federal Reserve notes, right? So that in a way is just an idol, right? So for us, idolatry, begins in the heart, begins internally. And what we say is that that's true for anything, including the stuff that you mentioned. So, addictions to alcohol or something like that, that's just another form of idolatry that can have a hold on our lives. And for us in Orthodoxy, one thing that is a big part of our daily life, our yearly life, is what's called the church calendar. And there's a reason for that, because there's periods of fasting. And this is a big part of, how we, it's not that refraining from things is inherently going to give you points with God. That's not the point of it. The point of it is that it helps you. It helps you to have self-mastery and self-control. That's the whole purpose of it. So it's not, so fasting and these kinds of things, they're not ends in themselves. They're merely tools for you to live the kind of life that, God intended. And so really it's kind of like a hospital of the soul, you could say, where the purpose of these practices and these things is to find healing and health, not just for the body, but also for the soul.
Sure, sure. I find myself having lots of discussions with vegans, and how, there's a lot of vegans, not all vegans, because I have a lot of very precious vegan friends. I love you guys. But, a very extreme school of thought is like, animals are absolutely not here to be food. They're not a source of food. They're not a source of nutrition or sustenance. We don't need them. So I imagine you've had some interesting conversations with vegans, if you're suggesting that the Bible says that it is okay to consume the flesh of animals.
Sure.
So you're saying that it is okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, veganism is, in our view, there are plenty of saints or people who take monastic vows who can choose to live that kind of a lifestyle if they want to. But in the New Testament, for example, it's very explicitly stated to be demonic to say that it's evil to eat meat. All things that are given by God for man's use. So even the animals are here for our use. Now that doesn't mean that we should be cruel or anything like that. Things have uses and purposes. So I'm not advocating factory, farming and the way big factories treat animals. Again, that's something I've critiqued a lot for a long time. But the problem is not inherently eating meat. So this is a moral question that's going to be determined by one's worldview as a whole. I would say that you have to kind of understand the totality of our perspective to understand why I would say there's nothing wrong with eating meat. For one, it's we have incisors, we have teeth.
I was, for a second, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was hoping you were going to say, for one, it's delicious. Like, that would have been so great.
Right, but of course, vegan people are going to make the arguments that, well, that doesn't matter, and you can make up for everything with vegetables and all this stuff. But I'm just saying, well, we have predatory teeth for a reason. Yeah, right. That's for chewing things like meat and flesh, right? So, long story short, the best way I would say to refute this is that most of the time, a lot of people who go into the vegan thing come from a libertarian perspective, and they have the idea that the non-aggression principle of libertarianism should be extended to animals. So the problem with this is that it gets into the assumption that, number one, the non-aggression principle is true. Number two, that you have some way to back it up on an atheistic or non-theistic perspective. Why should I adhere to the non-aggression principle? There's no, right? So in other words, they'll say, well, but because it's human decency and all this stuff, why should I listen to human decency? There's no reason or philosophical justification that you could give me that I have to follow that, especially on your libertarian perspective, which says, do whatever you want, just don't hurt people. Why should I not hurt people? I'm not saying I want to hurt people. I'm saying that on that perspective, there's no reason why I shouldn't hurt people. So what they do then is they extend that to animals, and they say that, well, we also shouldn't be aggressive towards animals. But first of all, they haven't established why I have to follow the non-aggression principle or why this is somehow self-evidently true. They're just assuming it. But in philosophy, you can't assume things, and you can't try to bind people to your principles without some sort of justification. Which they can't give. On the very fact of the way their worldview is constructed, there's no way they're going to be able to justify it. It becomes arbitrary. It just becomes, well, because I say so, because it's not good to do that. Well, why is it not good to do that? Because it's bad, right? Well, that's a circular argument. So again, no, there's no inherent reason why it's wrong to eat animals. I don't know. It is good. You're right. I'm a big fan of steaks. I grill out like every day. So
yeah, that just would have been really funny because people get it's an emotionally charged argument. I think it's reached this political. It's now it's a political thing.
Yeah, and one other thing I would say too is that you can actually read globalist writings like Alvin Toffler. He's one of the top globalists, and he talks about how they will sell people on the idea of veganism as a means to controlling your diet and your food. So what they're eventually going to do is outlaw meat, and all these dummies have fallen for this just from a bunch of YouTube crap, and they're all given this by the globalists themselves. It's the globalists who are selling you on the idea that you can't have your own farm, that you shouldn't eat cows, you shouldn't eat meat. And Plato talked about this back in his writings from an elite perspective. And he says in the Republics, don't let your slaves eat meat, just feed them rice and grains. So this is why we have soy boys. This is why we have all these weaklings. This is why you're being socially engineered into accepting the green agenda, smart cities, living in a coffin-sized apartment, austerity, not eating meat. They're going to control your diet, and this is all listed in the globalist writings themselves. So if you fall for it, it's your own stupidity. It's your own fault.
It really all does make sense. And you mentioned soy boys. It's one of my absolute favorite topics. Just because just in the last 10 to 20 years, we've noticed just such a shift in masculinity in young boys and young men, and it's quite terrifying to me as a woman.
Yeah, right.
I consider myself a more traditional woman, a feminine woman, in the sense that, I think women should be, we embody feminism. We should be feminine. And men are masculine and should have, the correlating traits. But it is interesting because to me, that seems like one of the most effective of their strategies against us is that, they've broken down the family unit. Now it's okay for, any number of strange arrangements here with the family, and the men have just been weakened to such a point where, God forbid, war comes directly to us. There's nobody else to answer the call because everybody's a fun boy, everybody's a cuck, everybody's a loser. So, that's certainly something that
Yeah, and this was written about in one of the top global strategist planners, Bertrand Russell. He wrote 2 books a long time ago in the 20s and 30s talking about how, one of these is in 1953, and one of them is in 1929, I think. And in Scientific Outlook and Impact of Science on Society, and again, he's one of the top globalist strategists, well known publicly. He says that in the future, when they set up this kind of global government, what they're going to do is control everybody's diet and basically turn them into these kind of weak drones that can be easily controlled by the state. And the way that they'll do that is through diet, injections, and state-controlled education. And he means inoculations, like excessive amounts of vaccinations. He was saying this back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, that this is how they would do it. But he specifically says diet. And he says, we're going to completely control your diet, and we're not going to let the underclass, the people, the population, have the sustenance that they need. We're going to keep them on this GMO. He talked about GMOs back then. Giving everybody GMO fake food. And get this, he says that the elite will remain in their class eating steaks and sumptuous dining meals. Like they're going to keep eating steaks.
Sure,
right?
Of course they are.
That's what he says. He says we're going to fool these idiots into adopting their own destruction. And he says that people are so stupid and malleable that we can convince them of anything.
Right. And we're stupid and malleable in part due to the vaccines and the
yes.
poor air quality and what have you, and the horrible, horrible education. It's absolutely horrible. I was lucky enough to be educated overseas because my father is a diplomat. So, and I didn't even last in American high school. I went to Stoneman Douglas in Parkland, Florida, where, one of the biggest shootings ever took place, interestingly enough. So, absolutely, people are stupid, people are weak, and they're, it's interesting, they let us know way in advance what they are doing, and yet we still fall for it. So it's like,
there's Charlotte Iserbyt. Are you familiar with her?
I am not.
You should look up her interviews and lectures. She was in the Department of Education under Reagan, and she talks about how the modern public education system was intentionally altered to be basically just social engineering. It's not about education. It's about socially engineering you to do what you're told. So she's somebody you should definitely look at. And then there's a great book that I wrote an article on. I called it Mass Public Indoctrination through something about mass public education. If you search that at my site, you'll find the article. But I just summarized a really good book called Messianic Character of American Education, and it's just quotations from America's most important philosophers of education and founders of public school, and they all openly say the exact same thing, that it's just about social conditioning and dumbing the people down.
All right, all right. So I want to wrap it up here. I've stolen you for enough time here. I'm very, very grateful to you. But moving forward, do you anticipate some kind of a just a massive revelation, as you would call it? Do you foresee people adopting more workable POVs where we can actually look at a kind of future where things are a lot better, things are improved? Or do you think we're all just, for the most part, just headed down the tubes as a country? Mostly, let's focus on the United States, just because, you know, we're here.
Yeah, well, I'm very critical of the United States, so I have a lot of videos where I critique the ideology of Americanism. I did this in the critique I did of Jordan Peterson, which got a lot of views, and I did this in the recent interview I did with a guy named Jefferson Lee, where we were talking about the Enlightenment and the history of America and all that. So if people want a more in-depth critique of what I think of the Enlightenment experiment that is known as America, they can watch those videos. So I don't have a whole lot of hope for America itself. Certainly, you know, it remains to be seen what kind of forms will develop in the future. But I think we're going to go into this kind of global planetary government, unfortunately. But I don't think that it will last. And the reason for that is because of it being self-destructive. So just because things have an appearance of order and you know, you can think of it like a corporation. You know, corporations have a lifespan. You know, they come and eventually they go. And what we're going into in the future is a giant global corporate government. So I think it won't last forever. It'll have a lifespan. It'll come. It'll be a really bad tyranny probably. But I think that will eventually collapse. And again, partly because, you know, I believe the biblical narrative, all the predictions in the Bible about the coming of Christ and what would happen when he came, they've all been borne out as accurate. So I would tend to think that I believe that the future is not dismal. It will be positive, and especially when we come to the end of history. So no, I'm not negative. I don't have any doubts about where we're going, but you know, there can be periods of tyranny, and things can be very bad for extended periods of time, unfortunately. So I think we will experience that. But no, I think that God has determined that humanity is not set for the dustbin.
I would agree with you on that. I would agree with you on that. I'm not, you know, I don't know how it's going to happen or what it's going to look like, but I just have a feeling, what can I say? A strong intuition that ultimately we're all going to be okay. So, Jay, thank you so much. If you could just let everybody know one more time where they can find you, and also how they can get a copy of your book, Esoteric Hollywood, please let us know.
Yeah, well, I had a copy of the book sitting here, but yeah, so what I do in the book is basically just go through a lot of these same topics, not so much the religious aspect of things that we talked about, but more so just geopolitics and conspiracy and what movie and symbolism in movies, and what movies are actually telling us reality. In fact, many movies are more realistic than mainstream news. So that's one of the theses of my book, and so I think I demonstrate that pretty well. And you can get that at my site. I mean, it's available on Amazon, but if you go to Amazon, they kind of undercut authors. Like, we don't make as good when people buy it from Amazon, because Amazon, you know, lowballs it. But you can get direct copies from my website that I sign. So I mail out dozens every week. You know, people ordering directly from me, and there's also outside the U.S. you can order it as well. So that's where you can get the book. And then at jaysanalysis.com is all my articles archived there, hundreds and hundreds of them, 700-800 of them. I have, I think, 500 or 600 videos on my YouTube channel, so you can follow me there. You know, I have backups for, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Gab, and all that in case any of those get pulled. I have been censored multiple times on like Facebook and Twitter. So follow me on all those. And then I do a subscription service where people can listen to my talks, lectures, interviews. I have, I don't know, a whole bunch of those over the last few years where people just subscribe for $4.95 a month for access to the subscriber content, which is lectures on Plato, Globalist book series, history, all the same types of stuff. My TV show is Hollywood Decoded, which is at Gaia TV. You can subscribe to that if you want to watch the first season, which is, I think we have 19 episodes of our show. Very proud of that. That came out really good. I'm also the co-host of Worski Live. So tonight we'll be interviewing Sean Stone, Oliver Stone's son, about his new movie. And we'll be talking about Eyes Wide Shut as well. So tonight's theme on Worski Live is Eyes Wide Shut. And Sean Stone's stories of real Eyes Wide Shut parties in Hollywood from I guess the mouth of him and Oliver, and stories from Oliver and all that kind of stuff. So that'll be fun tonight. We'll be dissecting Eyes Wide Shut, and I may have a new TV show coming up. I'll leave that to mystery. So
fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And folks, I wanted to let everybody know that even if you don't identify as a Christian or, Orthodox or anything like that, Orthodox anything, it really doesn't matter, because, my understanding of it is that there's just so much information here, a wealth of information from Jay, and you don't have to identify as any one thing. You can still learn so much. So, yeah.
Can I add that the religious and theological stuff at my website is probably 20 or 30% of what's there. The majority of it is we cover current events, we cover news, we cover all kinds of stuff on Boiler Room, which is a show that I feature that I've been on since it began. We cover, like you said tonight, Joe Rogan, Howard Stern style interview stuff. Like you said, kind of edgy comedy type stuff. So it's all over the place. The film reviews, movie reviews, there's tons of stuff. It's not just religious and theological. So it has an appeal to a lot of people who aren't even interested in that.
It definitely does. It's a dynamic talk show. Lots of jokes, lots of banter. Really, really healthy debates. I love it too. I love to see people on opposing sides of some topic.
Yeah, we debate atheism, we debate abortion, we debate politics. I mean, we just have, I love it. I think it's a blast.
All the fun stuff to trigger everybody. But at the end of the day, everybody realizes that what we're trying to do here is just communicate with each other and have those conversations. So very appreciative to you for coming on today, and also for all the work that you do and have done over the years. And hopefully one day you'll come back. I don't know. Let's see how miserable of an experience this was.
No, I had a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
All right. Fantastic. All right, folks. See you next time. Thank you for tuning in.